Good afternoon, and thank you very much for coming. My name is Teresa Moran, and I'm the Food Studies Theme Director, and it is my great pleasure to welcome you here for our Food for Thought series. Tonight we're going to have Professor Emeritus George Weckman talk to us about food, for fasts and feasts, religious traditions and regulation of food. And to introduce Professor Weckman, we have Professor Bill Owens here, Chair of Classics in World Religion. So,
thanks, Teresa.
Professor, thank you.
Well, it's a real pleasure for me to introduce George. He was one of a small number of faculty who helped and sustained a broad and popular range of religion courses in the Department of Philosophy originally. And this was a difficult task. Ohio University undergraduates have been keenly interested in studying about religion, but those who were ready and willing to teach them were few in number. George Weckman rose to this challenge by teaching an impressively broad range of religion courses, including the introductory course and courses on the Old and New Testament, Hinduism, Buddhism, Islam, and myth and symbolism. As a professor of religion, George Weckman published numerous articles. His principal focus has been on religious societies and communities. He's published over 40 book reviews and presented over 200 papers at meetings at home and abroad. And he also served as a senior civil servant to the discipline of religion. He was the executive secretary-treasurer of the Ohio Academy of Religion for 10 years. He served the same institution as secretary-treasurer, vice president, and president. George also has, as many of you might know already, a distinguished career of service to this institution and the community. He served as organist and choir director at Christ Lutheran Church since 1969 AD. Almost as long, just to be clear about that, almost as long as he's been a member of the faculty of Ohio University. He has been especially active in support of the arts in our community and served on the board of the Ohio University of Museum, the Ohio University Museum of American Art, and the Friends of the Kennedy Museum, and as president of the Friends of the Trizzolini Gallery as well. He's also served Ohio University as a member of the Faculty Senate, where he was chair of the Professional Relations Committee, and he compiled a notable record of service to the Department of Philosophy, serving 17 years as graduate chair and 18 years as assistant chair. But I have to say, from the standpoint of being the chair of Classics in World Religion, his signal act of service was the role he played in persuading Ohio University to recognize the importance of studying religion through the creation of a new major field of study. And then after doing that, he was tireless in his efforts in creating the new major and in helping the professors of religion who were in the philosophy department at the time, George and Elizabeth Collins and Jean Blocker, migrate to the newly combined Department of Classics and World Religion. And for no other reason than that, it's a pleasure and an honor to introduce George on any occasion.
Well, thank you, Bill. Yeah, there's an awful lot of history there, and that's a whole nother lecture about the preservation of religion studies at the university. But today we're involved in talking about food and religion. And a lot of people find that strange. You just heard that for many years I would teach an introduction to religion, an introduction to the study of religion, and it was necessary to drive home that religion isn't just what some people think it is, or think they are, referring to the religions. There's a widespread prejudice that it all has to do with beliefs dogmas, doctrines. I suspect that actually for most religious people that's the least important part of their participation in a religion. Of course, a lot of people play up the strange states of mind that are cultivated in some religious circles, mysticism and visions and whatever. That too, I think, can be a distraction, although it's also a part of this large world of things that we call religion. But it's when you get on the ground, so to speak, when you begin to talk about daily life and things that are a regular part of one's existence, that you come closer to what religion means and does and is as a phenomenon that is quite ubiquitous and quite a phenomenon of human culture. So talking about food and religion is actually, I'd say, more important and more basic than talking about theology or even morality, because that's where an awful lot of people, in very deliberate ways, practice their religion. Of course, I said religion or religions are involved here. Don't be confused when we make reference to things that aren't obviously labeled such. Nationalisms in many ways behave like religions, and there are other daily and ethnic or social phenomena which are very much involved. I never did, but I thought it would be nice someday to teach a course on religion and food, because there's so many other aspects that are involved. Just some of the things I won't be covering: washing, defecation, ritual as a moral obligation, although that might come up a little bit. But all of this about how one studies or what religion is doesn't really tell the tale about modern indifference to the phenomenon of food and religion, because I dare say that for the most part people aren't involved with food and religion because, and I'll put myself in that camp, my religious practice has nothing to do, or very little to do, with food. As one of my friends puts it, a lot of Americans are perfectly happy to eat anything that can't outrun them. So I speak somewhat from a secular point of view in talking about food practices and religion. Well, okay, this, I don't like to use equipment like the screens and fancy stuff that always seems to go wrong. So this is the whole lecture: when to eat, when not to eat, what to eat, what not to eat, why to eat what you eat, and why not to eat whatever is involved. So 6 parts. If you doze off, you can quickly figure out where you are. When is perhaps an easy way to start. When do we eat? When we celebrate. Yes, there are people who merely graze. There are folk who don't sit down for a meal with other people, which seems very odd to someone of my generation. But traditionally, when people want to celebrate something, they get together and they eat. One of the most obvious times, of course, is the time of harvest. Again, our modern world has little sense for the seasons and the appropriateness of foods to certain seasons, but we still have a Thanksgiving festival and perhaps other harvest events, whether it's the pumpkin festival over to our west or wherever. And so it is appropriate to feast when you have a lot of food on hand. Not only the grains or whatever you get from fields, but the animals that you don't want to have to keep over the winter. Certainly this is a good time to slaughter them. But then history gets into it. Even with that feast of Thanksgiving, we have to have a little story to go along. And so we pretend that it has something to do with remembering something that happened in New England some hundreds of years ago. So often it's historical events which occasion a meal or a special meal. One of the most obvious in this regard is the Seder, the Passover, the ritual meal of the Jewish tradition. Yes, it looks at one point like a celebration about the first wheat harvest and the killing of the lambs that you don't want to support for the rest of the season. But out of that rather domestic sort of background, you get a story, a very vivid story of escape and endurance, which includes not having enough food. And you also have connected to it the idea, and we'll talk more about blood later, that blood can protect you from harmful things. A lot of my references will be to the Jewish tradition. There are two reasons for that. One is that a source for these regulations is available in one of the most commonly printed sets of books in the world, and that is that collection of writings called the Bible. So you have an elaborate set of ideas and practices related to food in that series of volumes. You also have, of course, with the Jewish tradition, one of the most elaborate sets of food regulations. I think I could probably say that it is the most elaborate religious food set of rules that there is in anywhere in the world. So it's both available and explicit and highly developed. So history gets involved, and of course national history does too. So we have, in addition to Thanksgiving, other events that we remember with food. A sign of the fact that this is not just casual is when you have to have a certain kind of food. We're going to, of course, get to what to eat in a little bit, but we know that as soon as you have a prescribed diet, you know that something special is going on. And I'm thinking of that especially when we move from the religious groups, the national groups, or celebrations, to the personal or family celebrations. Okay, I have a sort of pseudo-granddaughter here on campus, and it's her birthday today. And so I said, well, tomorrow come and have dinner at my house, but I won't bother with a cake. Oh, that's a downer. Of course we need to have the cake because that's an indication that this is a celebration of one's birth so many years ago. Of course, in addition to birthday anniversaries, we have other rites of passage to which food, feasting, etc. can be connected. Weddings. Boy, is that ever a big industry in America. The money spent on wedding receptions dwarfs a lot of other expenses. Well, and then funerals. I've been associated with food. This reminds us of the famous potlatch of American Indians in the Northwest, where one of your signs of success in the world was giving elaborate meals on such occasions and inviting everybody. So this is a rather obvious thing. We have many times in which we can eat. So that's the feasts part of the title. Now we get to the fasts part. Okay. We all fast casually. That's why we call at least one of the traditional meals in our society, break fast. But of course, all of these things that I'm discussing are deliberate and not casual. And so there are many people who will, for instance, fast and not eat for certain periods of time and in certain ways. It bothers me, so I will just get that out front, that the Muslim Ramadan fast is so intense, so difficult. Do you realize that for a month, Muslims are supposed to abstain from all food from daybreak to sunset? And that includes water. That's got to be difficult at any time and in any place. But this last year, Ramadan occurred around the time of the solstice, the summer solstice, which meant that these were the longest daylight days, and especially in this latitude. I dare say it's just about impossible, but of course some people do try in one way or another. But we get into this problem again and again with all sorts of regulations that they are intended for a certain place and a certain time, and perhaps they don't work out very well elsewhere. You see, the Muslim calendar is a lunar calendar, which means that it's every year 11 days earlier. So it is now, for people in this climate, going to be, as the solar year goes by, for 2 or 3 years around the time of the summer solstice. Well, that's about as rigorous as you can get on fasting. By contrast, there have been some Christian fasts, usually only a day or so of the week, and then perhaps not as intense. But some form of fasting, some limitation on food consumption is traditionally observed in the series, or the series of days called Lent, which really just means spring. Fasting has been associated with other things, including death. There's a very strange story about King David in the Hebrew texts, where he fasted when his son was ill, but then he didn't fast when the son died. And the story is told as being rather shocking. But of course there are two reasons for fasting involved in that story. One is as a way of perhaps encouraging the health or doing something that will promote the health. But that's of course getting into our question about why one does these things. But then also there is of course a possibility of some kind of mourning fast, which could be expected. There are fasts associated not only with sickness, but with periods of distress. And interestingly, with transitions from one stage of life to another. When we talked about the possibility of feasting in connection with birth and its anniversary, or with weddings. These are the so-called rites of passage in which one changes status in one way or another, and especially that change of status at puberty was often marked in some way with a period of fasting. So we have a number of occasions in which there is a time to eat and there is a time not to eat. But then it gets interesting when we say, what do you eat? I've anticipated that already by saying at birthdays you have to have cake, at Thanksgiving you have to have turkey. And there are symbolic foods that are involved in a lot of the cultural and observant traditions. I'm amused by the fact that a dozen times or so in, again, those ancient Hebrew texts, the people who have been wandering for much of their life, but especially for a generation, are coming into the land that they conquer, Canaan or whatever we call it, and they say that it's going to be a land flowing with milk and honey. It's funny. They have milk and honey. They find the honey when they, locate some bees in the wilderness, and they have their flocks. They're not coming into a land flowing with milk and honey. No, it's bread and wine. Those are the things that nomads can't have. And bread and wine become staple foods and very important in the thought and life of people in that Hebrew tradition and in all the traditions that come from it. And they're both interesting foods symbolically. You can't get that flour to make bread with unless you grind the wheat. And it ain't easy. I once ruined a little grinder that I had. I thought I'd just put some wheat grains in it, and it killed the little device. And here we are in Athens. We have White's Mill on one end of town. Doesn't grind wheat anymore, but it did. And then Mill Street that goes down toward the place where the mill on the east was located. Mills were a very important thing and very much a part of local consciousness. And maybe we've lost again some of the meaning of foods when we don't realize that it takes a kind of torture and a kind of deliberate activity of stress to get this very important food, bread. We probably shouldn't get off into the business of yeast, but that also gets to be a bit of a question. Is yeast good or bad? Well, it's thought of as an infection at some point, and therefore sometimes unleavened bread is demanded instead of the kind of bread that we like, which is softer and nicer and higher, but of course it has holes in it. Wine. Similarly, you got to crush those grapes. I'll never forget being in Worms, Germany, along the Rhine River, and in a church there was a picture of Jesus in a wine press being squeezed, because again they were making that symbolic homology between Jesus and his blood and wine. Oh, blood! We'll have to talk about that when we get to what not to eat. But the blood of the grape, maybe that's okay. Well, okay. Just a few other examples. Easter eggs. You can't have Easter without the eggs. We don't eat the bunnies anymore, but the bunnies are still around because all of this has to do with fertility, and so therefore these are the prescribed meal or foods that are part of the celebration. I started thinking about this prescribed foods, and I thought, well, New Year's. I'm not fond of champagne, but most people think that you have to have champagne to celebrate the new year. What not to eat? Oh, again, the Hebrew Bible has so many things not to eat. And one of them is blood. Blood is life. And the whole business of koshering or kosher is to get rid of the blood as much as possible. Of course, you can't get rid of all of it, I guess, but certainly that's part of what's going on there. There are countries where you can get blood pudding. The Scots have blood pudding a lot. Not in the Jewish tradition, you see. But that's the least of it. My goodness. And these regulations from the Jewish tradition are not unique to it. I guess it makes sense, but you're not supposed to eat food that isn't killed the right way. I don't know. What is the right way to kill the animal? I mean, hitting it with a car might be as good as shooting it or with an arrow or a bullet, but you don't want to eat carrion. There are certain parts of animals that you're not supposed to eat. It's interesting, and I didn't realize it until fairly recently, that there is a regulation that you're not supposed to eat the fat of the sacrificial animals in the Jewish tradition. That might be better for your cholesterol, but at any rate, that's not going to happen. Then, of course, famously, there are certain animals that you're not supposed to eat. And these famous traditions of Judaism and Islam don't like pigs. They're not right. They're not good food. They're not right. Some people say it's because of health, but I say if that was the case, we wouldn't have so many Chinese. But there are often foods that are designated, somewhat arbitrarily, to be not right, not good for eating. One of the strangest, I just would have to say, as I survey the scene, one of the strangest prohibitions for food, what not to eat, is the famous Jewish prohibition of mixing milk and meat. And it causes an awful lot of muss and fuss. In hotels in Israel, there was one dining room and one kitchen for milk meals, and then a different one elsewhere in the hotel for the meat meals. And there's nothing that says don't mix them, except a number of phrases in the Hebrew tradition that say, don't boil a kid in its mother's milk. And nobody knows what that means, except that the most probable guess is that somehow in the native Canaanite or surrounding cultures, young goats were cooked perhaps ritually for a special meal in the mother's milk. But somehow that then was spelled out in this very complicated set of arrangements to prohibit the mixing of certain foods. There's something about mixing that is a big problem in the Jewish tradition and in other places too, where people need to keep things very clear. I've always put it, you can't plant succotash because the field has to have only one kind of seed in it. It's interesting that in the Quran, even though the Quran does prohibit the eating of pork, it's aware, the Quran makes reference to the Jewish regulations, and it says because of the wrongdoing of those of Jewish allegiance, and for their having turned many back from the path of God, we prohibited good things to them which had been made lawful. And that was also because they took usury. Well, we could get into the economics of religion in talking about interest or usury, but the point here is that this why, we're anticipating a why, of not to eat, might be because God is punishing you and using these regulations to punish you. But while we're in the Quran, one of the famous prohibitions in Islam, unlike this delight in wine in the Jewish and subsequent Christian traditions, or many of them, is the prohibition of alcohol. Ironically, the word alcohol is an Arabic word, but okay. And in the Quran, there's a passage that says, you don't want to do it because it's dangerous. Do not come to the rite of prayer in a drunken state before you know what you're saying. And there's another passage that says, if you're coming to the prayer, or if you're drinking and betting, having some games, that's going to be dangerous. But as you probably know, this advice not to pray when you're drunk then expands into a complete prohibition of the let me see, I'll read the passage to you. Of course, what Muslim scholars do is variously assign the surahs of the Quran to various periods in the giving of the Quran in Muhammad's life. And so the one that advised you not to drink before prayer then is abrogated or superseded by the passage that says, they inquire about intoxicants and games of chance, say, in both there's great evil, but also some advantage, but the evil is greater than the benefit. So you end up saying that it really isn't very good. And so finally, it says, don't drink wine at all or alcohol. It wasn't too long ago, I think last fall, that the Jain Indian phenomenon of starvation at the end of life was reported as a legal problem in India. I read it in the New York Times. I bring up that particular article, though, because in all of its discussion of the legal problems, even in India, starving to death was considered suicide, despite the fact that it was a noble tradition in the Jain tradition. But in all the article, it never mentioned the term ahimsa. But the Jains take ahimsa very seriously. Nonviolence, not harming. It's not only animals that you are going to harm, but eventually the greatest good comes from not harming any living thing, including the vegetables. And so you have this wonderful phenomenon of people who then deliberately stop eating and consuming other life. Of course, there are various other kinds of prohibitions. In India, cows are sacred and therefore no beef. In Bengal, though, I had water buffalo because it doesn't count as a cow. And so you do have different prohibitions as you move across the world as to what foods are or are not acceptable. Well, why. Instead of doing why as a positive, I'll start with why not. Why would you not eat? Well, there's a strong tradition all over the world that enters Christianity as a form, in the form of Gnosticism, or in perhaps other ways Manichaeanism, that says in effect, the body and its sustenance is bad, evil. So, of course, you don't want to feed it. The best thing to do, not quite in the way that the Jains want to get free of the harm, but in order to be free of a world that is dominated by evil. Some of these sects will even say that the world is made by an evil God. So the reason why you would fast, and certainly not feast, is in order to transcend the terrible physical body that you have. Sometimes that's thought of in terms of a purity, that somehow you can become purer by not eating certain foods or by not eating at all, or fasting or whatnot, as if food is dirty. And of course, it's obvious to anybody and everybody that it does result in one of the things we usually think of as dirty: fundament, dung. Some foods, though, might be thought of as dangerous, potentially poisonous, just because of their very nature. We've already seen, though, in the Quran that it's entirely possible that you don't want to eat because you want to, as it were, participate in God's punishment of human beings and of yourself. But even without the idea of punishment, if God says, don't eat bananas, you don't eat bananas. That's just all there is to it. And so selecting foods, especially when other people are eating other foods or the foods that are prohibited, is a way of obeying God. Now, if all of your society has the same food regulations, you don't notice it. But as soon as you go to a society in which there's ham sandwiches all over the place and you can't eat pork, then you begin to realize that you're a special community. So certainly one of the reasons why you don't is to preserve that sense of identity with your people, your tradition, your culture. It might be also a form of penitence, of penance, a way of doing something to punish yourself in lieu of what God or others might do to you. And I think there's a great deal of logic in that. Well, all of these things have a certain psychologic to them. But when you want to make up for something that you did bad, you might turn to depriving yourself of some of the things that otherwise you would enjoy. The term asceticism is often brought up in this connection. The term ascesis in Greek and its derived forms have to do with training. And so we're reminded that even to this day, athletes have certain foods or certain food practices which they adhere to as part of their training. And similarly, an asceticism can well be part of saying, you need to take control of your life, and one of the things you can control is what you eat and what you don't eat. I think it's especially in Hinduism that having that kind of control over yourself is thought to have a kind of power in and of itself. There are stories of the great ascetics becoming so powerful that they influence the gods. Again, the logic being that if you are so strong that you can control something as obvious in life as food, then you become a significant and powerful force in the world. But we might as well begin to draw this to a close with the issue of why do you eat from a point of view of various religions. I've mentioned that it's a celebration of life and often a part of celebrations of various occasions in the world. It's also in some way a recognition of the sacrifice that is built into life. Again, something that we don't experience as modern people who get our food from packages nicely prepared at Kroger or Walmart or wherever. But both Muslims and Jews regularly participate in the slaughter of animals. I did it once. I felt it was necessary to, and it's a messy thing to gut a lamb after it's just been cut, and swarm and cutting the skin off. But it's a way of saying that whenever you eat, you are taking other life. And does that sound negative? No, I'm saying that this is a positive meaning and a positive reason for eating, to, as it were, bring most obviously to one's consciousness the cost of food. Of course, that's very much the essence of the sacred meal of Christianity. It's very commonly celebrated and recognized that somehow food is related to the death of a being. So you see that an awful lot is involved in the extent to which people feast or fast. And I think that we probably have enough time for further discussion, and it could be that in the midst of all of this you've thought of other examples or of some other things that perhaps I could address. So I'll say that this is the end of the when, what, and why of eating and not eating, and say anything that you want to address.
Open for questions now?
Yes, questions now. Yes.
I'm wondering if you think it's a good thing or a bad thing that what it seems like in these times, in modern times, how there's a tendency to sort of borrow these traditions or these certain ritually specific foods, just sort of because who knows why, like it's popular to fast because of health, or certain foods that are associated with certain holidays are more or less just, you can get the recipes, everybody makes them, it's fun to do it, so does that take us further away from intent? Is that a good thing or a bad thing?
Well, to paraphrase your question, in case some people didn't hear it, what happens in the modern world when we know about these traditions and appropriate them perhaps haphazardly or with very different kinds of motivation? Well, I'll answer that in a couple different ways. One is, I would be willing to go pretty far in saying that there is a, quote, religion or semi-religion or pseudo-religion involved in the concern for health in modern culture. So instead of a preacher preaching you should not eat pork, we have a constant preaching of you shouldn't smoke, you shouldn't drink too much, you shouldn't do this, that, and the other, with an intensity that is super religious. So I think that there certainly is much in our present culture that has the characterization of religion, and especially when it comes to food and what foods to eat and not, and when and how, yeah, maybe there's no direct God involved, but that doesn't mean that there has to be a God in order for something to look like a religion. By the same token, though, there is something in the modern world that I delight in, and I don't want to evaluate any of these things. I guess I deplored the Ramadan because I think it's so difficult, but I'm just interested in finding out what people do, and a lot of people in the modern world will say, oh, gee, that would be fun to do that. But as they do that, maybe they are plugging in some vague way to the culture and the meaning of the original. So that if you decide to really get serious about Thanksgiving, it might say, and shouldn't we do what the story about Thanksgiving says about being closer to and more friendly with Indians, and because that's part of the myth of that festival. Right?
I have a question for you, George. I thought of a couple more examples of when and what to not eat, and I wonder if you could comment on them. So I'm thinking about the dignity of the body as a sacrosanct thing, and the Pythagorean prohibition against beans.
Yes.
Seems to be mostly because of flatulence.
Yes.
The prohibition in Bengali Brahmins culture against garlic and onions is because of the breath. And then I'm also thinking of people eating things that are impure deliberately, like in Tantra in India and in China and Japan to some extent, where they eat impure foods.
Yes, yes, okay.
Sometimes even impure substances to demonstrate that they have that they transcend the boundaries of pure and impure.
Yes, deliberately eating the forbidden is, of course, a rather strange but wonderful phenomenon. But you also bring up the question of air and breath, because we say in some of the ancient traditions that blood is life, but we also know that air or breath is life. But they're both necessary, and so focus can be on one or the other. And so it's entirely understandable that anything that involves air is going to be also relevant to deliberate selection. And I think you're right that the avoidance of beans had to do with the fact that it creates air, even back in the ancient days, let alone in modern times. So, and of course, we could laugh at some of these things, but they also indicate a reverence for and a recognition of breath and spirit, which after all is related to the word for breath.
There is a theory that there's a very rare genetic disorder called lactobism, where eating certain kinds of beans, I think it's fava beans, is actually fatal. And it's something which is prevalent. Well, it's not prevalent, but it does occur in the Near East.
Okay, well, it is possible then that there are some beans which would be quite deleterious. I generally shy away from the idea that ancient peoples and ancient traditions are based on scientific observation. And I'd say that it's much more obvious that most beans would have this kind of effect, rather than that some might be deadly. Yeah, yeah.
I was kind of wondering, is Corey here? No?
No, of course not.
No. Caffeine, why is caffeine forbidden in the Mormon church?
Yes, one of the interesting prohibitions in American religions is the caffeine prohibition in Mormonism. And it had to do with the fact that it obviously affected people, or at least it affects some people.
It's a strong drink is all it says, but they interpret it to mean caffeine.
I see. Well,
It's one of the laws, not the Book of Mormon, one of the second book, whatever it's.
well, again, it could be then that you have, as you do with the prohibition of mixing milk and meat, later commentators interpreting something in the original texts to be much more explicit. And so caffeine, of course, there's a lot of people in our culture that insist that caffeine has an effect on them. I've never had an effect from caffeine, so I just don't know. But I think, Lauren, you were trying to get into
a couple of comments. What's interesting in the jurisprudential reasoning and debating about prohibition on alcohol, khamra, is the emphasis on ritual, right? That you can't perform the ritual intoxicated because of the necessity of forming a proper intention, which you can only do if you're conscious of what your act is. And also the medicinal exception that is made for alcohol, so that alcohol is not a complete ban on it. It's permissible under certain circumstances, and if you're forced to drink it under duress, then go ahead and do it. And so it's interesting how some of these prohibitions are established, but then take on a life of their own as later generations debate the parameters of their application. Speaking of coffee, there's an interesting debate that gets started among Muslim jurisprudence about whether or not coffee is permissible. Or is it like khamra? Is it like this substance in the Quran that seems to be referring to wine, although its meaning is not entirely clear? And ultimately, it's, jurists fall on either side of that. There's a whole debate about smoking, also that is sort of in this kind of gray area, about substances that harm the body. And then finally, I was going to say, it's interesting to think about these as a sort of a negative case, thinking of secularism, right, as a negative case, where the sort of ignoring or consciously flouting, resisting these prohibitions becomes a way to establish a kind of secular identity. And I'm thinking of the way in which, for example, among Muslims who adopt a secularist stance will very much speak about the first time they got drunk as a kind of rite of passage. Just sort of very, very openly flaunting their rejection of the prohibition on alcohol.
Well, there's two very interesting things there, and I'm trying to repeat them so that the tape understands, and I'm not sure that your comments have been picked up, but they came through. Okay. So the first issue is, of course, what could be called the pastoral issue. Certainly, we know that even for Ramadan, well, if you're a pregnant woman or if you're traveling, you postpone the time of the fasting. There are reasonabilities, there are exceptions built into most of the prohibitions of the world, food and otherwise, which only indicates that these are meant to be workable and not to be just a theoretical possibility. So the jurisprudence, as you say, which is very intense in both the Jewish and the Muslim circles, spends a lot of time sorting out just what needs to be done in certain circumstances and what exceptions can be made. And on the one hand, we have this tremendous legal system, laws and argument and whatnot in both instances, but then we also have that concern to make it all workable, to find out exactly what the laws mean and to be precise about them. Secular. Of course, you're using the term secular in a way that I wish we wouldn't do, which means not just the non-religious, but the anti-religious. And certainly there is a great deal in the American tradition about the secular being the common world, which is shared by many people of many faiths and many non-faiths, as opposed to the idea that that world is anti-religious, you see. So I would want to make sure that we distinguish that. In the secular realm, though, we often argue for things in a religious way and on the basis of religion. So the question of foods that affect you, caffeine, alcohol, whatever. We're still mussing and fussing about it. And of course, we'll be voting in a few weeks about one of those substances. Is it good or is it bad? It affects you in one way, maybe, and it affects you in another way. This is a very religious kind of thing, because it's there in a purely secular world. We would only say, can we regulate it or make it safe for people? But no, many more issues come into people's minds because they are thinking that it has to do with the propriety, no, more than proper, the morality of being affected by a substance. So, as I say, a possible course on food and religion has a whole session on the non-religious and how it might be argued. We're certainly getting a lot of it in our world today, yes.
Vis-a-vis the concept of fasting, there's a thread, is there not, with sacrifice in antiquity? Because then also you're sacrificing something, so in that era they were sacrificing animals. Then they would obviously use the entrails as an offering to the gods, and they would feast on the remainder. But subsequently, fasting is a form of sacrifice, a continuation of those ancient traditions in a different way, sometimes bloodless and so on. So there's that thread, you see, and then from there, of course, you can build with the feasting. But these are ancient traditions that supersede the Judaic and Muslim traditions.
Yes, the idea that fasting is somehow sacrificial is certainly a regular theme. By the way, though, of course, yes, some of the sacrifices are communal, that is, the priests and the people supporting the sacrifice eat parts of the animal. But then, of course, there's the Holocaust, the total burnt sacrifice, and so that becomes a different kind of dynamic in its own way. And then there are sacrifices of grains. They are also presented. So that the whole notion of life as a sacrificial process in which other lives are sacrificed for ours and on it goes is certainly present in that. Now, the idea that fasting is only connected with that, though, I'd want to just widen and say that there's so much more else that could be going on.
Well, why don't we continue this discussion in the faculty commons? We have refreshments. And again, thank you very much, George.